My name is Adrian Cole. I'm 26 years old, and if you asked me to sum up my life, I'd say it's like a sprawling blues ballad. Long stretches of melancholy, punctuated by sharp bursts of joy, full of notes only I can truly hear. I live in Rochester, New York, a city where winters can swallow the streets whole, and the snow lingers long after the calendar says it should be gone. It's where I was born, where my memories are etched into every cracked sidewalk and frozen pond. These days I rent a modest apartment on the edge of the city, quiet, ordinary, not far from downtown. I can hear the wind howl between the buildings at night, and that's when I compose. Music is my refuge, the one place where the noise of judgment can't reach me. I'm the middle child of three. My sister Elaine is 4 years older, a New York City lawyer with a high-rise apartment and a calendar filled with court dates and business dinners. My younger brother Kyle, 2 years my junior, is a tech engineer working for a big software company in Albany. Both of them have careers that make my parents puff up with pride. Predictable, respectable, safe. My father, Gerald, is a floor manager at an auto manufacturing plant, a man who measures life in schedules and productivity charts. My mother, Ruth, teaches high school math, and for her, life is just another equation to solve neatly. Stability is their shared religion. I've never fit their mold. From the time I was 8, when I first picked up my grandfather's battered old guitar, I knew music wasn't just something I liked. It was air in my lungs. My grandfather, Henry Cole, wasn't a star, but in his youth he played saxophone in smoky little jazz bars down in the village, brushing shoulders with names that would one day be legends. He left that world behind to raise a family in upstate New York, but his heart never stopped beating to a rhythm only he could hear. Grandpa was the one who told me, "Music isn't a career, Adrian. It's a compass. It'll take you places you can't see yet." He and Grandma, a gentle woman named Edith who baked like it was her love language, were my biggest champions. They never rolled their eyes when I talked about composing. They never told me to be realistic. The rest of my family, well, to them, my passion was an embarrassing hobby. Elaine's law school accolades were framed in the hallway. Kyle got expensive coding classes before he was out of middle school. My hours at the piano or strumming chords were treated like wasted time. I can still hear my father's voice, "You can't pay rent with a song, son," or my mother's comparisons, "Look at Elaine, look at Kyle. Where will you be in 5 years with just that guitar?" One winter dinner when I was 17 burned itself into my memory. Outside, the snow was falling thick as curtains. Inside, Mom served her roast with mashed potatoes, while Elaine bragged about her Manhattan internship. Dad beamed, "That's my girl." Kyle shared something about a robotics competition, earning Mom's, "You're bound to succeed." Then it was my turn. I mentioned I'd just finished a piece inspired by one of Grandpa's old stories. I even sang a few bars, my voice shaky. The reaction was as icy as the weather. Dad frowned, "You're still at that? Music's not a future, Adrian." Mom sighed, "Sweetheart, you have to think ahead. Your sister's in law, your brother's in tech. You can't live off daydreams." Elaine chuckled and advised I learn something practical. I swallowed the hurt, finished my meal in silence, and later biked through the freezing dark to my grandparents' house. Grandpa welcomed me with a hug and the promise of music. We'd sit by the fireplace, him on sax, me on guitar, and the world outside didn't exist. Grandma would bring tea and cookies, her smile saying what words didn't need to. By the time I graduated high school, I knew I couldn't follow the safe paths my parents had lined up. On a Sunday morning, with Elaine visiting and Kyle glued to his phone, I told my family I wouldn't be applying to college. I wanted to compose full-time and work any job I needed to in order to support myself. The silence was suffocating before my father exploded. "That's insane. What will you live on? Street corners." Mom's voice trembled with disappointment. Elaine called me naive. Even Kyle, quieter than the rest, said, "You should reconsider." I defended my choice, quoting Grandpa's words about music being the soul, but they wouldn't hear it. My father pointed to the door. "If you're not going to school, you're on your own." I left that week, moving into a tiny apartment with what little savings I'd scraped together. I waited tables by day, wrote music by night. My parents' calls were constant reminders of their disappointment. Mom would ask if I was eating properly, then segue into, "You can still go back to school." Dad compared me to Elaine and Kyle until I learned to let the phone ring. The first 2 years were brutal. Rent late, ramen dinners, songs no one cared to hear. My one submission to a local competition got tossed in the first round. Many nights I sat in the dark, wondering if I'd made a colossal mistake. If it weren't for Grandpa and Grandma, I might have quit. They sent me food, slipped me money, and told me not to let anyone dim my light. I clung to their faith in me like a lifeline. Then when I was 20, the call came that shattered me. Grandpa had suffered a heart attack. By the time I got to the hospital, it was too late. I lost my mentor, my friend, the only person who truly understood my heartbeat. The days after his funeral were gray and hollow. Mom even used his death to drive home her point. See where music got him? Nowhere. I didn't answer. Instead, one night I dusted off a piece I'd started when he was alive, a song about his nights in Manhattan. I finished it, called it Sacks in the Snow, and posted it online with no expectations. Within a week, it went viral. Shares in the hundreds, then thousands. Messages from strangers saying it moved them to tears. Then came a call from an indie singer in Brooklyn, offering to buy the rights. The check was more than I'd made in an entire year waiting tables. It was the first crack of light in the long winter I'd been living through, and it was only the beginning. The day that first royalty check landed in my hands, I stared at it so long the ink might as well have been engraved in my mind. It wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that all those years of doubt, all the lonely nights bent over a guitar while the radiator hissed in the corner, had been worth something. I didn't rush out to celebrate. Instead, I called Grandma. Her voice crackled over the line, warm even through the static. "Adrian?" she asked, the way she always did, like my name was a note she never tired of hearing. I told her about the song, about the offer. I could hear her smile through the phone. "Your grandfather would have been so proud. You've done what he dreamed of." I didn't tell my parents, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I knew exactly what they'd say. Either they wouldn't believe me, or they'd find some way to diminish it. I wanted to protect that fragile flame of accomplishment, not expose it to a gust of their skepticism. In the months that followed, more opportunities came. A folk singer in Nashville commissioned me to write a ballad. A small production company in Los Angeles licensed one of my songs for an independent film. It wasn't glamorous yet, no limousines or magazine covers, but every deal felt like another brick in a foundation I'd been told I could never build. I was still waiting tables to keep the bills paid, still wearing the same worn boots in winter, still eating off thrift store plates. But now I had a secret. Every note I played at night felt like I was chiseling away at a wall that had been trapping me for years. 3 years passed this way. By the time I was 23, I'd saved enough to quit the restaurant job and live entirely off music. I was cautious. I'd learned the hard way that stability could vanish overnight, but the relief of not wiping down sticky tables at midnight was indescribable. Somewhere in those years, I decided to adopt a pseudonym, A.C. Frost. It was a nod to my hometown winters and a way to keep my personal life separate from the industry. Under that name, I began to sign bigger contracts. My style, a blend of jazz-inflected melodies and storytelling lyrics, was distinct enough to attract attention without me having to sell my face alongside the songs. One of my pieces, Winter's Whisper, unexpectedly landed on the Billboard Hot 100 after being recorded by a rising pop artist. The royalties from that single alone were more than my family would believe I could make in a lifetime. But I still didn't tell them. Every spare moment I wasn't writing, I spent with Grandma. She'd begun to forget small things. Where she'd put her glasses, whether she'd already had lunch. At first, I chalked it up to age, but I noticed the lapses were becoming more frequent, the questions she repeated more telling. One afternoon, I found her in the garden, standing still among the apple trees she'd tended for decades, looking utterly lost. She was holding a watering can, though the flowers were already soaked from the rain. When I called her name, she blinked, as if coming back from somewhere far away. "Oh, Adrian, I was just—" She trailed off, unable to finish. That was the moment the unease in my chest solidified into fear. I took her to see a doctor who confirmed what I'd been dreading, early-stage Alzheimer's. The words sat heavy in the air. It's manageable for now, the doctor said gently, but you'll want to start making arrangements. Arrangements. As if she were an object that needed storage. I drove her home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When we got back, she asked if I'd like tea, as though nothing had happened. Her resilience only made me more determined. I decided right then that I would not let her spend her final years in some sterile nursing home surrounded by strangers. I wanted her to have beauty, comfort, and dignity, and I had the means to give it to her now. So I started searching, quietly, carefully. I toured properties without telling a soul in my family. Finally, I found it. A sprawling 1920s mansion on the outskirts of Rochester, with a garden big enough to get lost in and apple trees that reminded me of hers. The house was worn, but the bones were strong. I saw it instantly. Her room with tall windows overlooking the orchard, a music room with Grandpa's saxophone in the corner, a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread again. I bought it outright. No loans, no partners. Then I hired an architectural team from New York to restore it. Not into some cold luxury palace, but into a home. We put in an elevator so she wouldn't have to climb stairs, railings in the bathroom, soft lighting to ease her eyes. I had them build a soundproof music room with shelves for vinyl records, a grand piano, and a place of honor for Grandpa's sax. While the renovations began, another idea took root, something wild, something I'd once experienced myself. On my 22nd birthday, I'd treated myself to a helicopter ride over the city. The sweep of the horizon, the patchwork of lights and snow below, it had been like seeing music. I wrote an entire song in my head that day. I remembered reading an article about how sensory experiences, like aerial views, could spark memories in Alzheimer's patients. And that's when I knew I'd buy a helicopter. Not for show, but for her. To take her up and let her see the world from the sky, to feel the wind and maybe, just maybe, catch a glimpse of moments she'd thought were gone. I chose a sleek, graphite gray Bell 407. I even began pilot training, though I planned to keep a professional on hand for safety. I hired a full-time nurse who specialized in memory care, a chef who could cook Grandma's favorite dishes from scratch, and 2 groundskeepers to keep the garden immaculate. It became a 6-month project, my days divided between music contracts and the slow, steady transformation of that house. I kept visiting Grandma, never hinting at what I was building. Sometimes she called me by my father's name. Sometimes she thought I was that boy who plays the guitar, rather than her grandson. But then she'd surprise me by asking if I'd written anything new, and I'd play her the soft melody of a piece I was saving for the day we'd take our first flight together. By the time the house was ready, the helicopter sat at a nearby private airfield, fueled and gleaming, and every staff member was trained and waiting. All that remained was to bring her there, and that's when my mother called. "Adrian, we need you at the house this weekend. Family meeting. It's about your grandmother." Her tone told me it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a decision, one I probably wouldn't like. I knew exactly what they were going to suggest, and I knew for the first time in my life that I was ready to stand in their living room and refuse. That Saturday, the wind was sharp with the bite of late October as I drove my weathered pickup through the narrow streets toward my parents' house. Dry leaves skittered across the pavement, the sky low and gray, like the whole day was bracing for an argument. I'd kept my outfit deliberately plain, old jeans, a faded flannel, boots scuffed from years of wear. I didn't care if they saw me as the broke one. I'd rather have them underestimate me for a few more minutes. When I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of my mother's roast and potatoes hung heavy in the air. It should have been comforting, but instead it pulled me back to all those tense dinners where my life choices had been dissected between bites. Dad was in his usual armchair, reading the paper. Mom bustled between the kitchen and dining room. Elaine sat on the couch, her Manhattan-polished appearance almost glowing against the dim room, scrolling through her phone. Kyle leaned against the doorway, earbuds in, glancing up just enough to give me a nod. And in the corner, in her old floral armchair, was Grandma. She clutched a framed photo of Grandpa, her eyes fixed somewhere far away. When I knelt beside her and took her hand, she blinked slowly and asked, "Adrian, or is it Henry?" My chest tightened, but I smiled softly. It's Adrian, Grandma, your grandson. No one else in the room seemed to notice the exchange. Dinner started with the usual pleasantries. Mom mentioning I'd gotten thinner, Dad asking if I was still doing the music thing. I answered in short sentences, not wanting to give them anything to use as ammunition. It wasn't long before Mom cleared her throat and steered the conversation. "We're here because we need to make a decision about your grandmother's living situation," she said. "Her memory is getting worse. Last week, she left the stove on and nearly started a fire. She can't be alone anymore." Dad nodded. "I found a good nursing home in the suburbs, clean, affordable. They can take her next week." Elaine set her phone down and said, "I think that's the best option. I can't be here. My schedule's impossible. You all know that." Kyle shrugged. "I'm too far away to be much help. At least at a facility, she'll have constant care." It was all so casual, like they were deciding where to store a piece of furniture. Grandma sat quietly, tracing the frame of Grandpa's photo with her thumb, excluded from the discussion about her own life. I set my fork down. "She doesn't want to go to a nursing home," I said evenly. "She should be with family. That's what she deserves." Dad's head snapped toward me. "Family? You? You can barely support yourself. How are you going to take care of her? Off your waiter tips?" Elaine smirked. "Adrian, be realistic. You can't just wish your way into being her full-time caregiver. It takes money, structure," Kyle added, "and energy. It's a huge responsibility. I don't think you're in a position." I felt the heat rising in my face but kept my voice calm. "I can handle it." Mom reached across the table, her expression soft but pitying. "Honey, I know you love her, but love doesn't cover medical bills. You don't know what you're taking on." The words twisted in my gut. They weren't just doubting my ability. They were dismissing every sacrifice I'd made over the last 6 years. Dad pushed his chair back. "So it's settled. I'll do the paperwork. She moves next week." I stood. "No, I'm taking her." The room went silent for a moment before Dad barked a laugh. "Don't make me laugh. Unless you've got a secret fortune lying around, you're not taking anyone anywhere." Elaine shook her head. "Adrian, this isn't a movie. Don't embarrass yourself." Kyle muttered, "Let's not drag this out." I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number. When it connected, I spoke clearly so everyone could hear. "Lisa, have the helicopter ready. Bring it to the field near my parents' house." Dad stared at me. "A helicopter? What the hell are you talking about?" Elaine laughed, the sharp kind that comes when someone thinks you've lost your grip on reality. "Please tell me you're joking." Kyle's eyebrows rose. "You're not serious." I looked at Grandma. "We're going for a ride," I told her softly. Her brow furrowed, then her lips curved in a faint smile. "That sounds nice, Henry," she said. 10 minutes later, I was walking out the door, the October air biting at my cheeks. I could hear the murmur of my family inside, their disbelief hanging in the air like static. By the time I reached the field, kids were playing pickup soccer, their shouts carrying on the wind. I checked my watch. 15 minutes, and then, far off, came the faint thrum of rotor blades. It grew louder until the sleek graphite-gray Bell 407 swept into view, sunlight glinting off its polished frame. Dust and leaves swirled as it descended, the sound rattling through my chest. My parents, Elaine and Kyle, arrived at the edge of the field just in time to see it touch down. Their expressions shifted from confusion to shock. I took Grandma's hand and guided her forward. "Come on," I said. "Let's show them." Dad shouted over the rotor noise, "Where did you get this?" I didn't answer. I helped Grandma into the cabin, fastening her seatbelt while the nurse I'd hired checked her comfort. Then I turned back to them. "Follow us. I'll send the address." Mom looked from me to the helicopter, her mouth half open. Elaine stood frozen, her phone hanging at her side. Kyle muttered something I couldn't hear. I climbed in beside Grandma, the pilot gave me a thumbs up, and moments later we lifted off. Rochester spread out below us, the Genesee River glinting like a silver ribbon, the last autumn leaves clinging stubbornly to the trees. Grandma's eyes widened as she looked out. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Henry always said the world looks different from above." I squeezed her hand. He was right. Behind us, my parents sat stiffly, the headset mics crackling with their questions. "Adrian, who's paying for this? Is this rented? Are you in trouble?" I let their words wash over me. Soon the answer would be undeniable. The flight was short, just long enough for them to realize we weren't headed anywhere they recognized. As the mansion came into view, its red-tiled roof gleaming through the trees, I felt my heartbeat match the rhythm of the rotors. When we landed in the wide garden, the staff was already waiting at the door. As I helped Grandma down, I saw my parents still staring at the house like it was a mirage. Elaine finally spoke. "What is this place?" I smiled. "Home." The autumn air in the garden was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp soil as I helped Grandma step onto the stone pathway. The helicopter's rotors slowed, the roaring wind they had stirred dying down into a steady, fading hum. Behind us, my parents climbed out cautiously, their eyes darting from the ornate wrought iron gate to the mansion's tall windows framed by climbing ivy. Elaine and Kyle had followed by car, and now stood at the gate, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and suspicion. The mansion looked like something plucked from an old novel. 3 stories of red-tiled elegance, the sunlight glancing off the polished glass panes, and apple trees stretching behind the property in neat rows. The front doors, dark wood with intricate carvings, stood open. Inside, warm light spilled into the garden, and the faint sound of jazz, Grandpa's kind of jazz, drifted out like a familiar voice calling us in. Anna, the head housekeeper, stood just inside the doorway, her smile professional yet welcoming. "Welcome home, Mr. Cole," she said, then looked at my parents with a polite nod. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Cole. Please come in." Dad stopped in his tracks. "What did you just call him?" I didn't answer. I kept my attention on Grandma, making sure the nurse had her steady as we led her toward the door. Her gaze was hazy, but she caught the music, the soft brassy notes of a saxophone playing sax in the snow, and her eyes flickered with a spark I hadn't seen in months. Inside, the living room opened like a scene set for a story I'd been writing for years. High ceilings arched overhead, a fireplace crackled with real logs, and the walls were painted a warm cream that caught the firelight beautifully. In one corner, on a simple wooden stand, stood Grandpa's saxophone. It gleamed, carefully polished, as though he had just set it down to rest between sets. Grandma stopped short, her lips trembling. "Henry's," she whispered. Her voice was so soft it nearly vanished into the music. "Yes," I said, squeezing her hand. "It's here, safe." Elaine's heels clicked sharply against the hardwood as she walked deeper into the room, her eyes sweeping over the leather couches, the Persian rugs, the massive windows overlooking the garden. "Adrian," she said slowly, "whose place is this? You can't tell me you just rent something like this." Kyle had wandered to the wall of bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines without taking his eyes off me. "Is this yours?" he asked, disbelief lacing every word. Anna stepped forward. "Mr. Cole has instructed the chef to prepare refreshments in the dining room," she said. "Would you like to be seated?" "Mr. Cole?" Dad echoed again, the title tasting strange in his mouth. He turned to me. "Adrian, you better start explaining before I start assuming the worst." I motioned for them to sit. The couches were arranged in a wide arc around the low walnut table, the firelight catching in the crystal teacups Anna was setting down. The air smelled faintly of butter and cinnamon from the pastries arriving on a silver tray. I took my seat beside Grandma. She was still holding the photo of Grandpa she'd brought from home, her knuckles pale around the frame. I poured her tea first, making sure the nurse added a spoon of honey the way she liked it. Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "All right, talk. Where did this come from? And don't tell me you've been gambling or something stupid." Mom reached for her teacup, but her eyes never left my face. "Adrian, please, this is too much for me to understand right now." Elaine sat back, arms crossed. "It's not that complicated," she said coolly. "He's either in some kind of debt or he's caught up in something shady. No one goes from ramen dinners to this without—" "I earned it," I cut in, my voice steady but sharp enough to stop her mid-sentence. The room went still. "For the last 6 years," I continued, "I've been writing music under the name A.C. Frost. You've all heard my work, you just didn't know it was mine. Sax in the Snow was the first. I wrote it for Grandpa. It went viral. After that, I signed deals with artists across the country, even overseas. My songs have been in films, commercials, on the radio. I've made over $25 million in royalties and investments." Mom's teacup rattled against its saucer. Elaine's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Kyle blinked slowly, processing. I bought this house, I said, gesturing around us, for Grandma, so she could live her days in comfort, not in some sterile facility. I bought the helicopter so I could take her on flights, to give her something beautiful to hold on to while she still can. There's a nurse here, a chef, staffed to care for her. She will never be alone. Dad sat back like the wind had been knocked out of him. His voice was quieter now. You did all this? By yourself? I had help from the people who believed in me, I said. Grandma, Grandpa. But yes, I worked for every bit of it. Every song, every deal. While you thought I was barely getting by. Mom put her hands over her mouth. Tears slipped between her fingers. I thought you were struggling, she said. I thought you'd ruined your future. You told me I was throwing my life away, I reminded her, though my tone wasn't cruel. But I knew what I wanted, and I did it anyway. Elaine leaned forward, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. AC Frost, that's you? I've had your songs on my playlists for years. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. I told clients about that winter track you did for the Lexus ad. I bragged about the songwriter without knowing he was my brother. Kyle finally spoke, his voice low. I've been writing songs too, secretly, but I never thought I'd have the guts to share them. Not after seeing how you were treated. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing the vulnerability there, and said, When you're ready, I'll help you. You don't have to hide. Dad cleared his throat. Adrian, I misjudged you. I was wrong. He shook his head, as though still trying to convince himself this was real. I thought you'd fail. I didn't see what you were building. I wasn't building it for you to see, I said. I was building it for her. I nodded toward Grandma. The nurse adjusted her pillow, and she looked up at me, her smile faint but warm. This is home? She asked. Yes, Grandma, I said, my voice catching. It's yours. Anna returned to announce that dinner was ready. The dining room had been set like a scene from a holiday postcard, candles glowing in silver holders, white linen spread across the long table, and dishes steaming with the aromas of roasted meats, fresh bread, and apple pie. Grandma's favorite. We took our seats. The meal began quietly, but soon the conversation shifted. I told them about my journey, the nights I'd nearly quit, the rejections, the breakthroughs. Mom listened, tears drying on her cheeks. Dad nodded occasionally, still subdued. Elaine asked careful questions about the business side of my work, as if trying to understand the world I'd built. Kyle smiled faintly when I promised again to listen to his songs. For the first time in years, I wasn't defending myself. I was simply telling them who I was. By the time dessert came, the tension in the room had softened into something almost like peace. Grandma had eaten more than I'd seen her eat in weeks. She leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, as the nurse brought her tea. After dinner, I walked her to her new bedroom. Large windows framed the orchard outside. The bedding was soft, the colors warm. On the dresser was a vase of fresh flowers and a small record player. I put on Kind of Blue, and as Miles Davis's trumpet filled the air, she smiled. Henry loved this one, she murmured. Yes, Grandma, I said, tucking the blanket around her. So do I. Downstairs, the fire still burned, and for the first time since I was a kid, I felt like maybe, just maybe, this family could find its way back together. But I also knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The first morning in the mansion felt almost unreal. Sunlight filtered through the orchard outside, spilling over Grandma's bedroom windows like liquid gold. From my own room down the hall, I could hear the faint shuffle of the nurse helping her get ready for breakfast, her voice gentle but clear, guiding her through the small steps of the morning routine. I went downstairs, the scent of fresh bread and brewed coffee leading me toward the kitchen. The chef, a soft-spoken man named Robert who had trained at a boutique hotel upstate, was plating scrambled eggs alongside a small slice of warm apple pie for Grandma. He knew it wasn't exactly breakfast food, but he smiled when he caught my eye. Special request from her this morning, he said. She told me she woke up thinking about the pies she used to bake. It hit me how much of this place was working exactly as I'd imagined. Each person here tuned into her comfort the way I'd been dreaming they would. I carried the plates into the breakfast nook, where the glass walls offered a perfect view of the orchard. The apples were just past their peak now, some fallen onto the grass, the rest glowing red in the cool light. Grandma was already seated, her hair neatly brushed, her cardigan buttoned askew in a way that somehow made her look more herself. When she saw the pie, her eyes brightened. "Did I make this?" she asked. "No," I said gently, setting the plate in front of her. "But it's just like yours." She took a bite, chewed slowly, and then said, "Henry always wanted pie for breakfast." I wasn't sure if she was remembering correctly or weaving memory with imagination, but it didn't matter. The warmth in her voice was enough. The days quickly fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for short walks in the garden when the weather allowed. The nurse, a woman named Claire, would keep a careful eye on her while I stayed close, listening to her talk about the flowers or the shape of the clouds. Sometimes she'd ask, "Do you remember the summer we went to the lake?" And I'd nod, even when I wasn't sure if the story had happened exactly the way she told it. Afternoons often meant time in the music room. The sound system would play old jazz records, Ella Fitzgerald, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and she would sit with her eyes closed, her hand tapping against the armrest in time with the rhythm. Every so often, she'd hum along, her voice faint but sure, like some part of her would never forget the melodies that had once filled her life. And sometimes, when her energy was good, I'd take her into the helicopter. The first time we did it after moving her in, I was more nervous than I'd admit. I'd gone over every safety detail with the pilot, checked and rechecked her seatbelt, made sure Claire was beside her. As we lifted off, I kept watching her face. At first, she simply looked out the window, her gaze calm but unreadable. Then we passed over the river, and she reached out, pointing. "That's where Henry proposed," she said suddenly, her voice trembling with emotion. I couldn't stop smiling. "It is?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving the view. We sat by the water. He said he didn't have a ring yet, but he had music, and that was enough. It was the clearest memory she'd shared in weeks, and it lodged itself in my heart like a precious relic. Each flight was different. Sometimes she'd point out landmarks, other times she'd just sit quietly, soaking in the scenery. Once, as we flew over the orchard from above, she whispered, "Looks like a painting," and I thought, that's exactly what I wanted her to see. The flights weren't just for her, though. They fueled me creatively in a way I hadn't felt since my earliest successes. After one particularly crisp winter flight where the snow blanketed everything in seamless white, I came home and wrote a piece called "Above the Snow." It was picked up by a Los Angeles singer, and within weeks it climbed into the Billboard Hot 100. But unlike before, I didn't keep all of this hidden from my family. After that dinner at the mansion, something had shifted. Mom began calling me weekly, not to question my choices, but to ask how Grandma was doing, to ask what new song I was working on. Dad came by one Saturday with a box of old photographs from his childhood, telling me he thought Grandma might remember some of them if we showed her together. Elaine sent me a text out of the blue. "Your new song is all over my office. Everyone's talking about it." I bragged that my brother wrote it. Even Kyle, who had been the quietest about my career, started showing up with his guitar. At first, he only wanted to jam, two brothers trading chords and melodies in the music room. But one evening, he played me a song he'd written years ago and never shared. It was rough, but there was heart in it. I told him so, and he looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was joking. "I mean it," I said. "If you want, I'll help you polish it. You have something here." From then on, Kyle began visiting more often. Some days I'd find him in the music room even when I wasn't there, strumming softly while Grandma listened, swaying in her chair. It wasn't lost on me how much of this house was changing all of us. The same family who once thought music was a waste of my life now saw it as something that connected us. Christmas was approaching, and I decided to host the holiday here. I wanted Grandma to have one more Christmas surrounded by everyone she loved in the place I'd built for her. I told Robert to prepare a feast: roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, warm rolls, and of course, apple pie. The living room would hold a tall tree draped in gold and white ornaments, the fireplace lit, Grandpa's saxophone polished and waiting in the corner. In the days leading up to it, Grandma would ask every so often, "When is Christmas?" And I'd tell her, "Soon, Grandma. We're going to have it here." Each time she'd nod like it was the first she'd heard of it, then smile. But a few nights before Christmas Eve, something happened that I hadn't planned for. I was in my studio upstairs, working on a commission for a film score, when I heard a soft, uncertain knock on the door. Claire stood there, her expression serious. "It's your grandmother," she said quietly. "She's more disoriented tonight. She keeps asking for Henry. She's upset, saying she can't find her way home." I followed her downstairs to find Grandma pacing slowly in the living room, still wearing her cardigan, but with her slippers half off her feet. She clutched the photo of Grandpa and kept glancing toward the door. "Grandma," I said gently, stepping into her line of sight. She stopped, looked at me, and her face crumpled. "Adrian, I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get back." I guided her to the couch, sitting beside her. "You are home," I told her softly. "You're safe. This is your house now." She shook her head. "No, my home has Henry in it." It took everything in me not to let my voice break. "Then we'll make sure Henry's here too," I said, and I went to the music room. I brought back his saxophone and set it on her lap. She ran her hands over the brass, and little by little her breathing slowed. Within an hour, she dozed off in her chair, still holding the saxophone like a child clutching a toy. That night, I realized that no matter how perfect I made this place, I couldn't stop the tide of her illness. But I could make every day she still recognized me count, and I promised myself I would. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in a blanket of snow. Outside, the orchard looked like something from an oil painting, bare branches etched against a pale sky, the last few apples like red ornaments hanging stubbornly in the cold. The mansion glowed from within, every window spilling golden light into the white night. I'd been preparing for this day for weeks. The tree stood in the living room, soaring almost to the ceiling, its branches draped in gold and white ornaments, ribbons winding around it like threads of sunlight. The fireplace crackled, the scent of wood smoke mingling with Robert's slow-roasting turkey drifting from the kitchen. I'd set Grandpa's saxophone and guitar in the corner, polished and ready, not just as decoration, but as a reminder that he was part of this night too. Grandma sat in her armchair near the fire, wearing the forest green dress I'd had tailored for her. Claire had brushed her hair into soft waves, and a little pin shaped like a snowflake sparkled at her collar. She kept looking at the tree, then back at me, as though seeing it for the first time each time she turned her head. "Beautiful," she said softly. "It is," I agreed, knowing she wasn't just talking about the decorations. The first to arrive was Mom, bundled in a wool coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She stepped into the living room and stopped, her eyes sweeping over the scene. "Adrian," she said quietly, "this is incredible." Dad followed, carrying a bottle of wine and a box wrapped in gold paper. His usual stoic expression softened when he saw Grandma. "Hi, Ma," he said, kneeling beside her. She blinked at him for a moment, then smiled. "Gerald," she said, using his name with a familiarity that didn't always come lately. Elaine arrived next, hair perfect as always, her hands full of shopping bags and a smaller, neatly wrapped present for Grandma. "I might have gone a little overboard," she admitted with a laugh, though there was a light in her eyes that told me this wasn't just about appearances. Kyle was last, his guitar case slung over one shoulder, snow dusting the hood of his parka. "Merry Christmas," he said, giving me a quick grin before heading over to give Grandma a kiss on the cheek. The atmosphere was warmer than I'd dared hope. No barbed comments, no veiled digs at my choices. Just family, stepping cautiously into this new chapter together. Dinner was set for 7. Robert and Anna moved quietly around the table, serving roasted turkey with cranberry glaze, creamy mashed potatoes, green beans with toasted almonds, and warm rolls. At the far end of the table, the apple pie waited under a silver dome, its sweet scent teasing the edges of the conversation. As we ate, I caught pieces of conversation drifting between my siblings and parents. Elaine was telling Kyle about a case she'd won, her voice animated. Dad asked me about the music business in a tone that was more curious than skeptical. Mom complimented the way I decorated, saying it felt magazine-worthy, which from her was about as high a compliment as you could get. But it was when I glanced at Grandma that my chest tightened. She was eating slowly, looking from face to face with a gentle smile, as though storing the moment somewhere deep inside. I wondered if she would remember this tomorrow. I decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had it now. After dinner, I stood, picked up Grandpa's guitar from its stand, and began to strum sax in the snow. The room quieted. The melody flowed easily, the notes warm and familiar in my hands. Mom's eyes shone, Dad's head dipped, Elaine's usual composure softened. Kyle, sitting beside me, tapped a quiet rhythm on his knee. When I finished, there was a silence that didn't feel empty. Then Grandma's voice, small but clear. Henry would be proud. It was all I needed. Elaine leaned forward. Play something else. I glanced at Kyle. You ready? He hesitated, then unlatched his guitar case and pulled out his own instrument. Let's do the one we worked on, he said quietly. We played together, his chords a little tentative at first, but finding confidence as we went. By the time we finished, Dad was leaning back with his arms crossed, nodding, and Elaine was actually smiling at him in that rare, approving way she usually reserved for clients. Mom clapped softly. That was beautiful, boys. The night stretched on in the best way. We opened gifts, drank wine, and laughed at stories I hadn't heard in years. At one point, Elaine pulled me aside in the kitchen, away from the others. I need to say this, she said, her voice uncharacteristically earnest. I was wrong about you, about all of this. I'm glad you didn't listen to me. I smiled. Me too. By the time the last of them left, the snow had stopped and the sky was clear. I stood at the window watching their taillights fade down the drive, then turned back toward the living room. Grandma was still awake, sitting by the tree. That was nice, she said when I came to sit beside her. It was, I agreed. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. You've made this house a home, she said, just like Henry would have. I swallowed hard. That's all I wanted. She leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the tree again. Within minutes, her breathing deepened, and she was asleep. I stayed there beside her, the fire warming the room, the tree lights twinkling softly. That night, as I carried her gently to her room and tucked her in, I realized something. This wasn't just about proving my family wrong anymore. It wasn't about validation or even legacy. It was about these moments, fleeting as they were, and making sure there were as many of them as possible before the illness took them away for good. The snow outside fell again in the early hours of morning, and the house was silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. Christmas Day would come and go, but this night, this perfect, fragile night, was one I would keep with me for the rest of my life. And I knew deep down that the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. January came in hard that year, with bitter winds that rattled the window panes and piled snow halfway up the orchard fence. The holidays had passed, and with them, that rare stretch of warmth between all of us. Life in the mansion settled into a quieter rhythm again, but also a heavier one. Grandma's memory began slipping more noticeably after the new year. It wasn't dramatic at first, more like a slow dimming. She'd still wake to the smell of coffee and pie, still smile at the music room, still light up on helicopter days. But she started confusing mornings for evenings, asking if we'd missed the train to the city, even though there was no train to catch. I knew it was part of the disease, but knowing didn't make it easier. Every time she forgot my name, it was like hearing it erased in real time. The nurse, Claire, handled it with a patience that humbled me. She explained things gently, never correcting too harshly. She once told me, "Don't fight to bring her into our reality. Go into hers. It's where she feels safe." I took that to heart. So when she asked me one snowy morning if we'd fed the horses yet, I didn't tell her there were no horses. I said, "Yes, they're in the stable and warm." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to sipping her tea. The mansion became more than just a home. It was a stage for small acts of preservation. Robert learned to bake bread the exact way she remembered from her childhood, so the kitchen smelled like her mother's house. Anna made sure her room always had fresh flowers because she once said, Henry never came home without them. Claire kept a calendar filled with events, tea with me in the garden, listening to records, or flights over the city, so that Grandma could feel she still had a full life. But it was the helicopter flights that seemed to spark the most clarity. One afternoon in late January, after a week of particularly cold weather, I decided we'd go up despite the wind. The sky was sharp blue, the snow below us like a blank page. We passed over the river, its edges frozen solid while the middle churned dark and swift. Grandma was quiet for a while, then suddenly pointed to the east. "That's where Henry used to take me dancing," she said. "They had a floor that lit up when you stepped on it." Claire caught my eye, her expression saying, "Remember this." When we landed, I went straight to my studio and began working on a song. I called it "The Floor That Lit Up." It was slow, dreamy, with a steady rhythm, like footsteps moving in sync. I recorded a demo and played it for her the next morning. She closed her eyes and swayed in her chair, and for a few minutes it was like she'd stepped back into that old dance hall. Around this time, my relationship with my parents shifted again. They started visiting once a week, at first just for coffee and to check in on Grandma, but soon it became something more. Dad would sit with me in the music room, asking questions about how contracts worked or what it was like to collaborate with artists overseas. Mom brought old recipes from her childhood, asking Robert to make them so Grandma could taste home. Elaine still called more than she came, but when she did visit, she seemed genuinely engaged. She once sat beside Grandma for nearly an hour, flipping through a photo album, even though Grandma only recognized a handful of faces. And Kyle was different now. He'd started writing more seriously, bringing me scraps of lyrics or half-formed melodies for feedback. I could see the same fire in him that I'd once carried alone. Sometimes we'd play for Grandma in the evenings, and even if she didn't know who we were in that moment, she'd close her eyes and hum along. Despite the progress, I couldn't ignore the truth. Her condition was moving faster than I wanted to admit. By February, there were more bad days than good. Some mornings she'd ask for Grandpa 3 times before breakfast. Other days she wouldn't eat unless I sat beside her, coaxing her with stories while she took small bites. One night, a storm rolled in. Thick snow, wind howling around the corners of the house. I was in my study reviewing a contract for a European tour I'd been asked to join as a songwriter, when Claire knocked urgently. "It's your grandmother," she said. "She's agitated, keeps asking to go home." I found her in the living room, pacing in her slippers, the photo of Grandpa clutched in one hand, her other hand trembling. "I can't find him," she said over and over. "He's waiting for me, and I can't find him." I led her to the music room, sat her in the armchair, and put on Kind of Blue. The first notes seemed to catch her attention. I took Grandpa's saxophone from its stand and placed it in her lap. She ran her hands over it, her breathing slowing. "Henry," she whispered. It was well past midnight before she fell asleep in the chair, still holding the instrument. I didn't move her until morning. That night changed something in me. I realized my time with her wasn't just limited, it was narrowing quickly. I couldn't waste it, not on work, not on anything else. The next day, I called my manager and told him I was passing on the tour. "You're sure?" he asked, surprised. "It's a huge opportunity." "I'm sure," I said. "My place is here right now." In early March, I decided to plan one last unforgettable helicopter flight, not just over Rochester, but across to the lake where Grandpa had proposed. I wanted her to see it from the air, to lock it into her mind one more time. It took weeks to arrange. The weather had to be clear, the nurse and pilot ready, and I had to find a day when she was in good spirits. But when the right morning came, I knew it instantly. She woke humming softly, her eyes brighter than they'd been in days. We lifted off just before noon. The air was crisp but calm, the lake frozen in wide swaths with dark water cutting through like veins. As we circled above, I pointed. "There," I said. "That's where it happened." She stared out the window, silent for so long I thought maybe she hadn't understood. Then she said, "He didn't have a ring, just a promise, but it was enough." Claire wiped at her eyes discreetly. I kept my gaze on the horizon, afraid that if I looked at her, I wouldn't be able to hold back my own tears. When we landed, I didn't take her straight inside. Instead, we sat in the garden, bundled in coats and scarves, sipping hot tea while snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. She held the cup with both hands and said, "You've given me more than I ever dreamed, Adrian." I didn't know what to say, so I just said the truth. "You gave me the reason to try." I didn't realize then how much I would hold on to that sentence in the months to come, or how quickly those months would pass. By the time the snow began to retreat and the first pale hints of spring pushed through the orchard soil, I could feel a shift in the air. not just in the season, but in Grandma's health. She'd always had better days when the light was brighter, when the sun streamed through her bedroom windows and warmed the quilt across her lap. But this year, even on the most beautiful mornings, her energy seemed to flicker. Sometimes she'd rise eager for our walks in the garden, asking for her scarf and coat before I'd even suggested it. Other days she would linger in bed, staring at the ceiling as though waiting for someone to arrive who never did. I told myself it was the natural rhythm of her illness, that there would be ebbs and flows. But deep down, I could feel that the tide was pulling more strongly now. Claire noticed it too. She didn't say much, but her eyes gave it away. That mix of compassion and quiet urgency that only someone who's seen this decline before could have. Once, after helping Grandma settle for an afternoon nap, she pulled me aside in the hallway. "You might want to think about what memories you still want to make," she said gently. "There's still time, but—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That night, I sat in the music room long after everyone else had gone to bed. Grandpa's saxophone gleamed softly in the lamplight beside me. I strummed my guitar, but every chord felt heavier than it should. I wasn't just playing notes. I was wrestling with the reality that there might come a day, sooner than I wanted to believe, when Grandma wouldn't know who I was at all. The next morning, she woke early and, without prompting, asked if we could go out into the orchard. I wrapped her in a light coat and walked slowly beside her, our steps crunching over the thawing ground. She stopped under one of the older apple trees, running her fingers along the rough bark. "Henry used to read to me here," she said suddenly. "He'd lean against the trunk, and I'd put my head in his lap and pretend I understood all the words." It was such a vivid memory that I wanted to bottle it up, to store it somewhere safe where time couldn't touch it. That afternoon, inspired by the orchard walk, I began writing a new piece, slow, melodic, full of gentle rises and falls, like a conversation between two people who didn't need to speak much to understand each other. I called it Under the Apple Tree. I didn't know if I'd ever release it commercially, but I knew I'd play it for her as often as I could. As spring unfolded, I decided to make our days even fuller. The helicopter flights became more frequent. Sometimes we'd circle the lake again. Other times we'd follow the river all the way to where it met the horizon. Claire said she noticed these trips gave Grandma a few extra hours of clarity afterward, as if the views from above reconnected threads in her mind that were fraying below. One afternoon in April, I invited the whole family for a garden lunch. It was warm enough to set a long table under the apple blossoms. Robert prepared lemon-roasted chicken, fresh bread, and strawberry tarts. Mom arrived first, carrying a stack of old vinyl records she'd found in the attic, albums that Grandpa used to play. Elaine brought an expensive camera and took photos of Grandma among the blossoms. Kyle came with his guitar, and after lunch, we played together while she clapped along, her smile bright and easy. For a few hours, it felt like time had slowed down. Even Dad, usually reserved, joined in by telling stories about his childhood, how Grandma used to hum while hanging laundry, how Grandpa would whistle the same tune every time he came home from work. She laughed at that, nodding, and for a moment I saw the woman she used to be, whole and sure of herself. But just a week later, the pendulum swung the other way. It was a rainy Tuesday when Claire found her in the hallway, confused and frightened. She was trying to put on her shoes, saying she needed to catch the bus before it left. When Claire gently told her there was no bus, Grandma grew upset, insisting that Henry was waiting for her downtown. I rushed to her side and knelt down so we were eye level. "Grandma, it's okay," I said softly. "We're not going to miss anything. You're safe here with me." She stared at me for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "Who are you?" The question landed in my chest like a stone. I swallowed hard and forced a small smile. "I'm Adrian, your grandson." She hesitated, then her face softened. "Oh, Adrian, yes, I remember now." But her voice carried uncertainty, like she was repeating something she'd been told rather than something she knew. That night, I didn't write music. I didn't even touch the guitar. I sat in the quiet, letting the weight of that moment settle into me. The next morning, I made a decision. If her memory was going to slip more often, then I'd make sure the things she experienced now were worth remembering, even if only for a few minutes at a time. I'd pack the days with beauty, laughter, and music. I'd keep giving her skies to look at and songs to hum. So I began to plan something bigger, something that would combine everything she loved into one day. It would start with a helicopter ride over the river and the lake, then lunch in the orchard under a canopy of blossoms, and end in the music room with all of us, me, Kyle, maybe even Elaine, playing for her until the sun went down. When I told Claire my idea, she smiled. It's ambitious, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you. The hardest part would be getting the family all in one place without letting them turn it into a debate about her condition. I wanted this day to be about joy, not worry. I sent out the invitations myself, keeping the details vague. A special day for Grandma. Come ready to spend time together. In the days leading up to it, I found myself rehearsing the music I wanted to play. Under the apple tree, sacks in the snow, and the floor that lit up. I imagined her sitting in that armchair, her hands resting on Grandpa's saxophone, her eyes lit with that rare, precious clarity. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if she'd be herself that day, or if she'd be somewhere far away in her mind. But I knew I had to try. Because the truth was, I was starting to understand what Claire had meant. There was still time, but not nearly as much as I wanted. The morning of the special day arrived with one of those rare, flawless skies, a deep blue washed clean by the rain the night before. The orchard shimmered under the sunlight, every apple blossom dusted with tiny drops of water that caught the light like glass beads. If I believed in signs, I would have taken it as one. I was up before dawn, pacing through the house, checking every detail. Robert was already in the kitchen, rolling out dough for the pies. Anna moved through the living room with fresh vases of flowers, filling the air with the scent of lilacs and apple blossoms. Claire was upstairs with Grandma, helping her get ready. I'd laid out the soft, cream-colored dress we'd picked together weeks earlier, knowing she'd love the way it matched the blossoms outside. Around 8, I slipped into the music room and tuned my guitar. My hands moved out of habit, but my mind kept circling the same thought. What if she wakes up confused today? What if the whole plan falls apart before we even start? At 9 sharp, the sound of the helicopter's rotors began to build in the distance. My heart thudded in my chest. I'd arranged for the pilot to land just beyond the orchard, on the small private helipad we'd built months ago. This would be the first surprise of the day. By the time the machine touched down, the family was beginning to arrive. Mom and Dad came first, carrying thermoses of coffee and a tin of cookies Mom had baked herself. Dad looked around at the bustling staff and the manicured garden and shook his head, almost smiling. "You've turned this place into something else, Adrian," he said quietly, as if he was still getting used to admitting it. Elaine arrived next, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a new camera lens. "If the light stays like this, I'll get some incredible shots," she said, though her voice carried a hint of something softer, like she actually cared more about capturing the memories than just the perfect frame. Kyle rolled up a few minutes later, his guitar case slung over his shoulder. "Got the set list?" he joked, and I nodded. Then Claire appeared in the garden, leading Grandma by the hand. My breath caught. She looked radiant in the cream dress, her snowflake pin glinting in the sunlight. Her hair, brushed and gently curled, framed her face in a way that reminded me of old photographs. She looked at me, smiling as if she knew something. "We're going flying, aren't we?" I laughed. "You guessed it." The family followed us to the helicopter, the spring air filled with the rhythmic chop of the blades. Claire helped Grandma into her seat beside me while the others climbed in. Elaine kept her camera in her lap, eyes darting between Grandma's face and the horizon. We lifted off, and almost instantly, Grandma's eyes lit up. Below us, the river wound its way through the city, gleaming in the sunlight. She pointed, her voice stronger than I'd heard in weeks. "That's where Henry taught me how to fish, right there by that bend." Mom turned to me, eyes wide, and I could tell she was seeing it too. The clarity, the spark. We flew over the lake, circling slowly so she could take it all in. "It hasn't changed," she whispered. "It's all still there." When we landed, Robert and Anna had transformed the orchard into an open-air dining room. A long wooden table sat under a canopy of blossoms, draped in white linen and set with delicate china. Platters of lemon-roasted chicken, fresh bread, and strawberry tarts waited alongside steaming pots of tea and coffee. Grandma sat at the head of the table, the sunlight streaming through the blossoms above her. The family gathered around, talking, laughing, eating. There was a rhythm to the conversation that felt new, not forced, not tense. At one point, Kyle took out his guitar and began strumming quietly. I joined in, the two of us trading melodies until the notes seemed to weave themselves into the warm air around us. Grandma clapped along, smiling like a child, the blossoms drifting down onto her shoulders. After lunch, I led everyone back into the house and into the music room. Grandpa's saxophone gleamed in its place by the window, catching the late afternoon light. I picked up my guitar, Kyle sat beside me, and we began the set I'd planned. First came Under the Apple Tree. Grandma leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on me, humming softly along with the melody. Then The Floor That Lit Up, its rhythm gentle and swaying, made her tap her foot in time. Finally, I played Sax in the Snow, the song that had started everything. By the time I hit the last note, there was silence in the room, the kind that comes when no one wants to break the moment. Then Grandma spoke, her voice clear and steady. "You boys sound like Henry and me, all those years ago." I couldn't answer right away. I just smiled, my throat tight. Elaine set her camera down and said, "I think that's the best photo I'll take all year," even though she hadn't lifted the lens for the last song. For the rest of the afternoon, we stayed in that room, playing, talking, sharing small stories. I saw Mom lean toward Dad, whisper something, and then they both just sat there, watching Grandma with expressions I couldn't quite read. As the sun began to set, the blossoms outside turned gold in the fading light. I walked Grandma to her room, helping her out of her dress and into her soft nightgown. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding my hand. "You've given me a beautiful day," she said. "You give me one every time you smile," I replied. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep. Then she lay down, and within minutes, she was asleep. I stood there for a long time, listening to her breathing, thinking about the way her eyes had looked when she talked about fishing with Henry, or when she recognized the lake. I didn't know how many more days like this we'd get, but I knew I'd fight for every one of them. And that night, as I sat alone in the music room, strumming the melody of Under the Apple Tree again, I realized something. Today hadn't just been for her. It had been for all of us, a reminder of who we were before the distance, before the judgments and misunderstandings. It was proof that even with time running out, there was still room for days worth remembering. The first hint that something was wrong came a week after the orchard day. It was a quiet Wednesday morning, the kind where the house felt wrapped in a kind of calm that made every sound carry. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, the faint hum of the kettle, the muffled steps of Anna moving through the dining room. I was in the music room, working on a melody that had been stuck in my head since the helicopter flight over the lake, when I heard Claire's voice upstairs. It wasn't loud, but there was an urgency in it that sent me moving before I'd even processed the words. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, Claire was leaning over Grandma's bed, speaking softly but quickly. Grandma's face was pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. She looked small, smaller than I'd ever seen her. "What happened?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "She woke up disoriented," Claire said. Then she complained of dizziness, and her blood pressure's low. "We need to get her to the hospital now." The rest of the next hour blurred together. I called an ambulance, my hands cold and clumsy on the phone. Mom and Dad arrived before it pulled away from the driveway, both of them pale and wide-eyed. Elaine and Kyle were still on the road when the paramedics loaded her into the back. I rode with her, gripping her hand the whole way. She was conscious but barely speaking, her eyes darting around as if she wasn't sure where she was. At the hospital, they moved her into a curtained bay in the ER, hooking her up to monitors. The beeps and the hiss of oxygen filled the small space. A doctor came in, a tall man with tired eyes, and explained that she was experiencing a severe drop in blood pressure, possibly related to dehydration and fatigue, but they needed to run more tests to rule out a cardiac issue. "She's stable right now," he said, "but we'll keep her overnight for observation." I nodded. but my mind was still stuck on the word stable right now. That night, I sat by her bed, the hospital room dim except for the glow of the monitors. Every so often she would stir and look at me, and sometimes she'd know my name, sometimes she wouldn't. Once she whispered, "Henry," and reached out like she was trying to touch someone just out of sight. I let her hold my hand and didn't correct her. By morning, her vitals had improved enough for them to discharge her. The doctor gave me a list of adjustments, a stricter hydration schedule, more rest between activities, smaller and more frequent meals. "She's still fragile," he said. "Even small changes in routine can have an impact now." Back at the mansion, I moved her to the bedroom on the first floor, the one with the French doors that opened into the garden. I wanted her close to the main part of the house, where someone could always check on her. The family rallied more than I'd expected. Mom began spending a few days a week here, helping Anna with meals and sitting with Grandma in the afternoons. Dad came by to read to her. Not long novels, but short stories and old newspaper clippings he thought might spark her memory. Elaine brought her work laptop and set up in the library so she could be nearby, stepping away every hour or so to check on her. Kyle started coming over almost every evening, his guitar slung over his back, ready to play for her or with me. For a while it worked. She seemed calmer, more comfortable. There were still days when she didn't know who we were, but she smiled more, laughed occasionally, and even asked to sit in the orchard when the weather was warm enough. But the scare had shifted something in all of us. The unspoken truth hung in the air. This was no longer just about maintaining her quality of life. It was about making the most of what was left. I began to cancel more work. My manager protested, reminding me of deadlines and contracts. I told him I'd still write, but I wasn't leaving the city for now. "I have a commitment here," I said, and left it at that. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she came home from the hospital, I decided to take her up in the helicopter again. It had been too long since our last flight, and I wanted to give her another view from above before her strength faded more. The sky was overcast but calm, the clouds a soft gray blanket overhead. We flew low over the river, past the old mill where she and Grandpa used to walk in the summer. She didn't say much, but she kept her eyes on the view, her hand resting lightly over mine. When we landed, she looked at me and said, "You're a good boy, Adrian." I couldn't remember the last time she'd said my name without hesitation. That night after she was asleep, I found myself in the music room again. The guitar felt heavier than usual in my lap. I played Under the Apple Tree on a loop over and over until the chords felt like a heartbeat under my hands. And then, without really thinking about it, I began writing something new. A slow, almost fragile piece, full of pauses and long, bending notes. I called it For When the Sky Closes. I didn't know when I'd play it for her. I just knew it was the song I'd want her to hear if time ran out sooner than we all hoped. By the end of that week, her strength had dipped again. She tired quickly, sometimes needing help even to sit up. Claire was more watchful than ever, keeping track of every detail, what she ate, how much water she drank, how long she napped. I asked her, late one night when we were alone in the kitchen, "How much time do you think we have like this?" She hesitated. "No one can say for certain, but you should be ready for changes." The words echoed in my head long after I'd gone to bed. I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the heater, knowing I couldn't prepare for this the way I had prepared for the house or the helicopter. This wasn't something I could fix with money or planning. The next morning, I woke to find the orchard coated in frost. The blossoms turned to crystal in the cold. It was beautiful, but it also felt like a warning. Beauty that wouldn't last. A reminder that nothing stays in bloom forever. And I knew then that the next chapter was going to be harder than anything that had come before. The frost on the orchard that morning lingered well into the day, stubborn against the weak winter sun. It set a tone that I couldn't shake, an unease that hummed in the background no matter what I was doing. Grandma's health had been holding steady since the hospital scare, but steady now meant something different. It meant she was comfortable but fragile, able to enjoy the smallest moments, but unable to manage much beyond them. She no longer joined us for every meal. Some days she would sit at the table for 10 minutes before asking to be taken back to bed. Claire told me this was expected. Her body's slowing down, she said gently, as if wrapping the truth in softer words would make it easier to take. It didn't. One evening in early March, I found Grandma awake in her room, staring out the French doors into the orchard. The moonlight spilled across her quilt, giving her a quiet glow. She didn't look at me when I came in, but I could see her lips moving slightly, as if she was talking to someone I couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, Grandma?" I asked softly. She turned her head, her expression calm but distant. "Henry's out there," she said. "He's waiting for me under the tree." My throat tightened. "Do you want to go outside?" She shook her head. "Not tonight. I'll see him soon." Then she turned her gaze back to the orchard, her hand absently smoothing the blanket over her lap. I sat beside her for the next hour without speaking, listening to her breathing, wondering if she was really seeing something or if it was just the mind's final trick, making the people we've loved seem so close again that we could almost reach them. That night, I called my manager and told him I was stepping back from all active projects. No deadlines, no contracts. "For how long?" he asked. "For as long as it takes," I said. From that point on, my days revolved entirely around her. The staff was still there, but I wanted to be the one who made her tea in the morning, who sat in the garden with her when she felt strong enough to go outside, who read to her when the nights were long. Kyle visited more frequently, sometimes staying late into the night to play guitar with me in the music room. One evening, after we'd been playing for nearly an hour, he asked quietly, "Are you ready for what's coming?" I didn't look up from the guitar strings. "No, but I don't think you can ever be ready for this." Elaine started showing up unannounced, often with her camera. She didn't take as many pictures as before. Instead, she would sit with Grandma and show her photos from decades ago, narrating them like stories even if Grandma didn't respond. I think she was starting to understand that sometimes the act of being there mattered more than the result. In mid-March, Grandma had a particularly lucid morning. She woke early, ate almost all of her breakfast, and asked if we could sit in the orchard. The air was still cold, but the sun was bright, so we wrapped her in blankets and wheeled her outside. The apple trees were bare but beautiful, their twisted branches reaching toward the pale sky. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to the sun, smiling faintly. "I like this spot," she said. "It feels like home." We sat there for nearly an hour, just listening to the wind. At one point, she reached for my hand and said, "You've done well, Adrian. You made a good life." It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like the final approval I'd been chasing my whole life, and from the only person who had believed in me from the start. That evening, after she'd gone to bed, I went into the music room and opened the leather-bound notebook where I'd been working on For When the Sky Closes. The song had been evolving in small pieces over the past weeks, but now I felt a strange urgency to finish it. I stayed up until nearly dawn, writing and rewriting, letting every memory of her guide my fingers across the strings. By the time the first light of morning touched the windows, the song was complete. I didn't know when I would play it for her, but I knew it would be soon. The chance came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, Claire told me that Grandma had been unusually tired, sleeping more than usual. She still responded when spoken to, but her words were softer, fewer. "It might be a sign," Claire said carefully. "We should focus on comfort now." That afternoon, I brought my guitar into her room. She was lying in bed, her eyes half closed, but she stirred when I sat beside her. "Music?" she murmured. "Yes," I said. "Something new. I wrote it for you." I began to play For When the Sky Closes. The melody was slow and tender, each note carrying the weight of every moment we'd shared in this house, every flight over the river, every afternoon under the apple trees. Halfway through, I saw her lips curve into a faint smile. Her eyes opened just enough to meet mine, and for a fleeting moment, I swear there was recognition there, not just of me, but of everything. When the last note faded, she whispered, "Beautiful," and closed her eyes again. I stayed by her side until she drifted into sleep, the guitar resting across my lap. I didn't know if she'd remember the song in the morning, but I knew I'd never forget the way she'd looked at me in that moment. Over the next week, her energy continued to fade. We kept her comfortable, the house filled with soft music and the scent of flowers from the garden. Mom and Dad stayed overnight in the guest rooms. Kyle and Elaine were here almost every day. It was as if we were all instinctively gathering close, holding the edges of her world together for as long as we could. I could feel the ending approaching, but I didn't let myself think about it for too long at a time. Instead, I focused on the next cup of tea, the next story, the next smile. Because that's all you can do when the sky is starting to close. And in those small, precious moments, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't just caring for her in these final days. She was still, in her own quiet way, taking care of me too. The morning the house went quiet. The sky over the orchard was the palest shade of blue, the kind of color you only notice when you've been watching the light day after day. I woke before the alarms, before the staff started their rounds, with a pull in my chest that said, "Get up now." The hallway was still, the grandfather clock ticking like a metronome set too far apart. Claire was already in Grandma's room, her hands gentle on a blanket that had slipped to one side. She looked at me and didn't need to say anything. I knew the language of her eyes by then. It's close. We decided not to move Grandma upstairs or change anything about the room we'd arranged for her on the first floor. The French doors were cracked just enough to let in the smell of morning and the faint, damp chill from the garden. On the dresser, a small vase of apple blossoms leaned toward the light. Mom and Dad came in first. Mom with a knit shawl she draped over Grandma's shoulders, Dad with a book of short poems he'd been reading to her lately. Elaine and Kyle arrived a little later, stepping into the room quietly, as if volume alone might break what was left of the moment. Robert brought a tray of tea we mostly forgot to drink. Anna stood in the doorway, hands clasped, in that respectful way people have when they want to help and know that help isn't what's needed. Grandma slept for long stretches, waking just enough to recognize a face or a voice, then drifting again. When she opened her eyes, they were clear in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. "Adrian," she whispered once, as if trying the name on to make sure it still fit. "I'm here," I said, taking her hand. "Music," she murmured, and I knew what she wanted. I brought my guitar to the edge of the bed and started with Under the Apple Tree, soft enough that the strings barely lifted the air. Kyle sat beside me and found the second line the way he always did, careful and steady. We carried the melody between us, trading phrases like a conversation that didn't need words. When we finished, Grandma's eyes were closed again, but I saw the faintest smile at the corners of her mouth. "Lovely," she breathed. "Henry?" I didn't correct her. I set the guitar down and took her hand again. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just listened to the house. The clock, the wind pressing at the doors, the distant shift of footsteps in a kitchen that kept working because kitchens always do. Around midday, the light turned warmer. Elaine, who had barely touched her camera these past few weeks, lifted it once and then lowered it without taking a photo. She moved closer to the bed and began telling Grandma a story about the first case she'd ever won. A simple matter, years ago, with a client who'd cried in her arms after the verdict. "You would have liked her," she said. She laughed like bells. Grandma's fingers twitched, as if bells were something she could still hold. Dad cleared his throat and opened the book. He read a few short lines about spring and the way the world tilts back toward life even if you think it won't. His voice was rough, the kind of sound that belongs to someone who doesn't read aloud often, but means every syllable. Mom wiped her eyes on the edge of the shawl and then folded it tighter around Grandma's shoulders, as if warmth could hold off the inevitable. In the late afternoon, when the sun slanted across the quilt in narrow bars, Claire leaned close and said softly, "If you want to play her the new song, now would be a good time." I nodded. My hands were steady when I picked up the guitar. My breath was not. Kyle didn't join me this time. This one had been written for her alone. I began for When the Sky Closes, the notes spaced like careful steps, the melody bending towards something that felt like both arrival and goodbye. Halfway through, Grandma's eyes opened. She looked at me the way she used to, not searching, not confused, just looking. I held the last chord a beat longer than I'd written it and watched her breathe in, then out like she was catching the sound. When the song ended, she whispered, "Home." I set the guitar down and leaned in so close my forehead touched hers. "You're home," I said. "I promise." An hour later, with the sun a hand's width from the horizon and the whole house holding its breath, she exhaled once, lightly, as if the room itself had grown too heavy. Claire checked her pulse and nodded, tears in her eyes. Mom reached for Grandma's cheek. Dad pressed his lips together the way he did when he was working hard not to fall apart. Elaine stepped to the window and opened it a little wider. Kyle bowed his head. The room was still, a different kind of quiet. We stayed like that for a long time, not because we didn't know what to do next, but because leaving felt like admitting time had moved on without asking permission. Eventually, Robert took the untouched tea back to the kitchen. Anna brought fresh water for the flowers. Claire closed Grandma's eyes with the same care she'd used to wake her every morning. I didn't cry right away. Grief is strange that way. It's a tide that comes when it wants, no matter what you're holding on to. Mine found me hours later in the music room when I lifted Grandpa's saxophone from its stand and felt the cool weight of it in my hands. I couldn't play it. I never learned. But for a moment I wanted to put my mouth to that instrument and make a sound that could carry to wherever she'd gone. Instead, I set it back down and let the ache roll through me, full and clean. The days that followed blurred into lists and logistics, phone calls, signatures, a gracious woman from the funeral home who spoke in gentle, efficient sentences. We chose a simple service in the small church where Grandpa had been eulogized years before. The flowers were from the orchard, arranged by Anna and Mom, white and pale pink blossoms with sprigs of green. At the service, people told stories I'd never heard. How Grandma once organized a neighborhood potluck for a family who'd lost their house to a fire. How she used to bake pies for the hospital volunteers because kindness needs fuel. How she danced. There were so many stories about the dancing. Elaine did take pictures that day, but only of hands. Mom's on Dad's arm, Kyle's on my shoulder, and old neighbors clasped around a program like it was a letter from a friend. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a page. I told them about the flights, about her pointing where the lake had held a promise, about the way music stitched room back into her eyes when nothing else could. I said that if love had a shape, for me, it would always look like an orchard at noon and a chair by a window where someone was humming under their breath. After the service, back at the mansion, we gathered in the living room. The fire was lit even though the air had warmed. On the low table lay a stack of vinyl records Mom had brought, and on top of it all, the leather notebook with the title of my last song written in my small, slanted hand. Dad stood there a long time with his fingers resting on the edge of that notebook before he said, not to anyone in particular, "Your grandfather would have liked that title." Then he turned to me. "You made good on your promise to her." I nodded, unable to answer. In the weeks that followed, life didn't return to normal because there wasn't a normal to return to. The house was quieter, but not empty. I found myself keeping the routines we'd built together, walking the orchard in the morning, opening the French doors to let in the air, putting a record on in the afternoon, and letting the room fill with horns and piano. Sometimes it felt like superstition, as if the rituals themselves could keep her close. Sometimes it just felt like the right way to measure time. Work waited, as work always does. Emails multiplied. My manager, who had learned at last to stop pushing, sent a short message that said simply, "When you're ready." I was and I wasn't. The songs were there, hovering at the edges like birds willing to land if I held still long enough. One evening, Kyle came by with his notebook and a look I recognized. Eager, scared, certain enough to say the thing he knew he had to say. "I want to release one," he said. "The one we worked on in January. I want to do it right." "We will," I told him. "We'll do it in her name." That was the first shape the future took. Not a grand plan, just a song we would build carefully and send into the world like a small lantern. We recorded it in the music room over 3 nights, the same room where Grandma had tapped her foot and where I had played the last song she ever heard. On the 4th night, I mixed it until the air felt clear inside the track. Kyle titled it "Blossoms in the Snow." When he sang the final line, his voice didn't waver. Elaine spent more time upstate than anyone expected, at first to help with paperwork, and then because, as she put it, the silence makes sense here. She stopped bringing the big lenses and started taking pictures on a small old film camera she'd found, shots that looked like memory even before they were developed. One morning, she handed me a print of Grandma's hand resting on the window frame, the orchard blurred beyond it. "For the studio wall," she said. "It still hangs there." Mom and Dad came by on Sundays. We didn't talk about who had been right or wrong years ago. We talked about recipes and payroll and whether the apple trees needed trimming. Dad brought a toolbox one afternoon and fixed a stubborn hinge on the library door, whistling an off-key tune I realized was Sax in the Snow. Mom hummed along without noticing. Spring grew into summer. On the first warm evening, I set a small table under the oldest tree and invited everyone to sit there. We ate bread and cheese and berries Robert had piled into a bowl large enough for 5. After dinner, I told them what I wanted to do next. "I don't want the house to go still," I said. "I want it to be what it became for her, a place where music makes room when memory can't." I laid out the plan I'd been sketching in the margins of my grief. A small foundation in Grandma and Grandpa's names, funding music therapy sessions for memory care patients in the city, free afternoon concerts in the orchard every month from spring through fall, and a scholarship, one per year, for a young composer who couldn't convince anyone that a song could make a life. A.C. Frost would endow it quietly. Adrian would run it loudly enough that people could find it when they needed it most. No one argued. Elaine offered to handle the filing. Dad said he knew a contractor who could build a small pavilion near the back fence for the concerts. Mom volunteered to coordinate volunteers because kindness needs fuel, and she said it in the same tone the neighbor had used at the funeral. Kyle asked how many songs I wanted him to play at the first event. On the night before the inaugural orchard concert, I walked the rows alone. The grass brushed my ankles. The air smelled like green things and cut stems. Above me, the sky was clean and wide, the way it had been the morning she left. I stopped under the tree where we'd sat that lucid morning in March and pressed my palm to the bark. "We're ready," I said, and I meant all of us. The house, the family, the version of me that had learned the difference between proving something and giving something away. The next afternoon, people came. Families pushing wheelchairs, couples holding hands, neighbors from streets I hadn't walked since childhood. We set out rows of simple chairs, and when they filled, people leaned against trees or sat on blankets in the grass. Claire, off shift but present, stood near the back with a smile that was both pride and peace. I stepped onto the small platform, guitar in hand, and the orchard hushed. I didn't introduce myself as A.C. Frost. I just said, "Thank you for being here," and began Under the Apple Tree. The sound carried through the branches. A child laughed. Someone cried, quietly. When Kyle came up to join me, he looked out over the crowd with the same bright steadiness he'd had when he told me he wanted to release his song, and I felt something settle inside me that had been loose for years. We closed with "For When the Sky Closes." I told them it was for anyone who needed a song built like a doorway. The last notes hung in the warm air, and for a heartbeat I had the impossible sense that if I turned, she would be there on the edge of the crowd, shawl around her shoulders, tapping her foot, ready to tell me that Henry never brought flowers without whistling. After the concert, people lingered, as if leaving would break a spell. I stepped away from the platform and found a small space between 2 trees where the view opened to the river in the far distance. The helicopter sat quiet on its pad beyond the orchard, sun flashing off the glass. I didn't need to fly. The sky felt close enough from here. That night, when the last chair had been stacked and the lights strung through the branches were glowing like patient stars, I went to the music room and set Grandpa's saxophone on the stand beside the window. The French doors were open. The late summer air moved through the curtains. I placed the leather notebook on the piano and wrote a single line under the title I'd given the next project, "A House That Remembers." Then I closed my eyes and listened to the house breathe. The clock ticked its long, merciful beats. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pan settled with a soft clink. From the orchard, a night bird called once and then again. I picked up the guitar and began to play, not to prove anything, not to fight anyone, not even to hold on, just to let the song do what it had always done for us, make space, make light, make a way forward.